Hi there. Welcome to today's video about good panel management. That's part of the judging module. Today we'll be covering basically how to make sure that we have a good methodology of managing the panel. This is particularly important for people who are just starting out to chair or people who are facing issues with managing their panel and things like that. Probably this video is not for like very experienced judges who like know this stuff, but still might be a good idea to see another perspective. Cool. So, like the previous videos, let's first set out what our goals are. Goal number 1 is to be done by 15 minutes. This is the number 1 goal in terms of tournament efficiency, because you don't really want to be the judge that slowed down the entire tournament. 15 minutes may be a bit short for like newcoming judges, but this should be the goal that you are going after. And but if it's like 25 minutes, that's fine. 25 minutes is more or less borderline, but you for sure shouldn't go above 25 because that's slowing down the whole tournament, especially if we're talking about majors. Second thing is to allow equal time for all participants to discuss. So this includes, your panelists that have a vote and your training judges as well. Obviously, the bigger the panel is, the more time this is going to take. So maybe if we're talking about the 5-person panel here, because like the competition decided to have a lot of wing judges, then maybe you can take a bit more time, like let's say 20-25 minutes to discuss everything. But still, like it should be kind of proportional. But still, you should try to do it in the 15 minutes. Importantly here, you should think about two things: that some people may need more time and more encouragement, so like more empathy, more being like positive to them, for them to speak out and to say their points and things like that. Especially people who like people, for example, who are like women and gender minorities, who for example face like sexism and stresses like this when they are when they are discussing their opinions and things like that. So you need to be mindful of that. You need to be mindful, for example, people not interrupting them or trying to take over the discussion, which is actually point number 2, that some people might be too eager to like discuss and argue and things like that, where you have to control them. You have to say, hold on, let's listen to each other. I don't think that's correct. Let him, her, them finish, and things like that. So like those are the 2 things that you need to keep in mind. The way that you can simply do it is just by like literally tracking on your sheet of paper, this person I knocked out, this person said their opinion on the clash or said their opinion on this, then this person should probably discuss more, etc, etc. And finally, make sure that all teams are discussed and all questions in the round are answered. So by this, I don't mean like in the traditional way, all teams were considered, we gave equal proportion of time to everything, because some clashes are just plain obvious. Like when a team significantly easily beats out another team and the justification for that is in 30 seconds, you don't really have to spend a huge amount of time to discuss it. You should still say it, for opinions purposes and for people to so for the rest of the panel to understand it and things like that. But the question here, what I mean by this is, you need to not be in a situation where, for example, it's a messy debate, there are different calls, and you're first discussing top half, then you're discussing CG, and then all of a sudden it's minute 27, and there's literally no time to discuss CO, so they never had a fighting chance to begin with. You need to make sure that you are giving proportionate time for a certain amount, for like all teams and all comparisons, and you shouldn't be in a situation where you haven't discussed the team. By this I also mean if that team could be relevant, but to position them you would require let's say a 5 to 6 minute discussion, and you spend only 30 seconds on them. Like this is something that you need to be very mindful of, because it's not really fair for them. Cool. So these are the 3 goals: done by 15 minutes, ideally. Allow all participants to discuss equally, and make sure all teams are not considered, discussed, and all questions in the round are answered in terms of how material engages and things like that. Cool. So what are then the best practices for this particular thing? The first and most important thing that you should do is have your timer out. This is super crucial for judging management and things like that, because if you're spending too much time on, let's say, a clash, let's say you're discussing top half for 8 minutes, you should probably call in the vote then. Right? You should probably say, okay, we're probably not really, we're not making a lot of ground here. We need to finish this discussion so we can move on to other things. And the other way you can do this is by having a timer out and just going about it. The second thing is to write down the initial calls of panelists and give them, let's say, a minute and a half, especially if they're less experienced. And this sentence is super important. You need to tell them, look, what I want from you is a tentative call, not a full call. This could mean, for example, I have this and that team from first to fourth, but I'm, for example, wondering between second or third and things like that. You need to explain these things to most new judges, because most new judges, especially those that don't have very much experience in British parliamentary debating, they don't really know how to do the rankings and things like that, or the technology behind it. Funnily enough, this is because they didn't read the damn manual, which honestly answers most of these type of things before they go into the competition, which is partly their fault as well, but it's also just they don't have experience. So let's say how would this theoretically look like? The debate is done. You tell them, you give them a minute and a half, and let's say you have you and another 3 people panel. You could write panelist 1, panelist 2. And for example, if the third person is a trainee 1. And that way you just rank the call. They, for example, say, I have CO, then I have CG, but I'm wondering on the gov bench. I have OG, and then OO. Then the other panelist has, OO, CO, CG and OG. And then the trainee has another random call. That's just for humorous purposes. But the point here is you need to write it down like this. And then when we reach to part 3, you need to see where there are differences and if there is something that people agree with. So in this scenario that we're looking above, let's just remove the trainee actually for simplicity purposes. In this scenario, the 2 panelists have a totally different call. They disagree on all particular levels. They don't agree on any positioning. So this is what we call a worst case scenario. So a worst case scenario would be where, it's not something that we call, it's just something I made up right now. A worst case scenario is where you have panelists that have totally different calls. They don't agree on any positioning. They most likely don't agree with your call as well. And obviously this is a spectrum here. The more closer it is to a connected call between the teams, on the left side of the first end of the spectrum is everyone has the same call, we just have to discuss it. Right side is there are totally different calls, we need to resolve it. So those are the 2 scenarios. The first scenario that we're going to look at is if the calls are not that different. So we're not talking about the worst case. We mostly agree on most things, but for example, 1 or 2 comparisons we can't really agree with that. So here where you have to do is if most panelists agree on certain clashes. So let's say they agree on the top half, but the bottom half they have different rankings. They can't really position them. In this case, the way that you need to position the discussion is just to say, okay, let's start with closing government. Panelist number 2, you have closing government being above, closing opposition. We have me and the other panelists have closing opposition above closing government. Can you give us the justification as to why you think that team should position where they are? It's good to start with the minority vote always, even if you yourself are within the minority vote as well, because that way you can start. It's basically the easiest path to victory, right? You can start it off that way, and then the other teams can. The other participants can also respond and engage with this discussion. So when you're doing this, you need to ask them particular questions along the lines of, why do you think they win? So what are the specific reasons they win? Because what I've noticed is with many inexperienced panelists, they just ramble, and what they think is repeating the team's words or just reading out of their flow is the equivalent of explaining why a certain team wins or doesn't win, where in reality that's not the case. That's just reading of what teams said. The other problem with this is that many teams just say a lot of things, but they don't necessarily prove those things. So this question, like, what do you think? Why do you think they win? What are the specific reasons that you think they win? Positions actually the incremental things that they're trying to prove. Or secondly, if that panelist were to, let's say, ramble about again in this particular moment, just like saying, oh, like, but they also have this line, they also have this line, you can just straight up ask them, but what did they prove? Like, what did they actually explain as analysis to justify their claims? And when you actually give them this filter, the next thing which happens to them is they actually start looking at their flow, and they're like, either they didn't prove it or there is some justification for why they prove it. So then the discussion becomes tangible rather than immaterial, just looking at what the word salad is between different teams. Importantly, you should not weigh in, so like explain why you think the clash goes one or the other direction, before you've let everyone everyone to speak on this discussion. So it's best to then allow panelist 2 to respond back to panelist 1, and then after the response is done, you can then weigh in and explain, I think that this and that, I think that's fair that panelist 1 pointed out to, but I think there is clear weighing given, or there is this response, or I just don't think their case is proven. You know, the same things that we talked about in the previous modules. And what usually happens is there are 3 scenarios here. The panelist flips directly, which is like the main thing that happens with this type of thing. The second thing is the panelist doesn't flip directly and then thinks of another reason when then you have to engage with that reason. And then the third thing is the panelist just isn't persuaded by you. In which case, if the panelist isn't persuaded to you, if you have like fundamentally different understandings of the debate, then it's just fine to call in the vote and continue on with the other clashes to be on time, and things like that. But what you can also ask the panelists is this particular question, which is, what will it take to persuade you? Which positions like the panelist in a position of like doubt, let's say, where the panelist says, well, if I'm able to see, I don't know, like a response to this, or a weighing to this, or like analysis to this, I can be persuaded. And after that, you can say, but they actually did explain this in this particular moment, and then the panelist can flip. You can also use this question on yourself, by the way, but presumably we're operating within a system where we're talking about in-rounds right now, mostly, and like there's a significant difference between you and the panelists in terms of experience and stuff like that. So this is the good case scenario. This is like a okay round where things aren't that problematic, there is plenty of time, you can discuss it, and things like that. Let's examine the worst case scenario, which is we have totally different calls scenario. The first and most important thing is to start with basics. So firstly, set up what happened in top half, right? OG versus OO. Then you look at CG, then you look at CO. The reason you need to do it this way and not any other way is because if you can set up who won the top half, then it's much more easier for you to talk about the other comparisons. But second thing I've noticed is usually when you resolve one comparative, the other comparisons between teams actually becomes more easy. Like, because now, okay, but if OG beats OO, then CG can also potentially beat OO, but they can't beat OG. But whereas if it's the other way, we think that opening government loses to opening opposition, and then closing government beats opening opposition, then by default they also need to beat opening government. Like, there are so many scenarios that can be resolved by just discussing the top half and how the top half operates, and then moving on to the other teams. The important reason here is that if you're able to set this discussion, if you're able to persuade all the panelists on this particular comparison, then you can use this as a baseline rule for what happens later in the debate. Importantly, this should not be a discussion more than 7 minutes. If you have a 4-person panel, maybe 10 is a good mark, but you shouldn't discuss this like that much. It should be something that you can resolve fairly easily, and fairly fastly. Cool. So that's how you do it. You just do it methodologically, and you don't have to be scared of calling in the vote, of just saying, okay, I think we've discussed this enough, we need to call in the vote. How many people think it's OG? How many people think it's O? Cool, let's move on to closing argument. Cool, let's move on to closing opposition. Again, this is like in the scenario where we are operating within the presumption. This is the worst case scenario. So everyone has a different call, and we just need to arrive at some kind of decision to agree between each other. And finally, you should ask them questions about the material that they're trying to like push. You should ask questions like, did they prove this? Did you try this response? How do you weight this particular thing? Like you, again, like in the previous modules, you need to ask debate-related questions on the things that they are doing, because that way you can provide, like, let's say, a single source of truth between each other. Because if you can fundamentally agree that an argument was stated and not proven, then that really lowers the amount of persuasiveness that, let's say, a judge is willing to push for a certain team if they can never justify, okay, they actually did prove this, or okay, they didn't prove this, and things like that. Cool. So basically, to recap, timer out, as their initial call, try to push them to have a tentative call. Depending on what the scenario is, you either start by just looking at what are if like most of you agree, just looking at where you disagree. If you disagree fully, then you need to start with basics, top half, CG and CO, and you need to not be scared of, for example, calling a vote, not be scared of, for example, stopping people if they ramble on too much, and asking them debate-related question: did they prove this? Did you track this response? How do you weight this? Etc. Etc. I hope this helps, but honestly, like, to be completely honest with all of you, you just especially for new chairs, you just have to be not scared to like basically state your opinion and basically say call out things. That's the main thing. I think the biggest problem judges simply face, especially new ones, and that's why most likely you're looking into this workshop, is it's like courage, or like I'm doubting myself, maybe I shouldn't be chairing type of mentality. Look, you are chairing. You are chosen by the CAs to do this. It is like they specifically chose you to chair this room, so you already have the authority to do that. You shouldn't be scared to, for example, interrupt people if you have to. You shouldn't be scared, for example, to, I don't know, like call on the vote. You shouldn't be scared to do these things. Like if you perpetuate like your own self-confidence, then the other panelists will most likely, stop what they're doing and agree with you. So yeah, so that's it on the good panel management module. See you in the next video.